Words About Books is a poorly spoken podcast.
Today we're going to be covering the Poppy War, and as we were recording this, we realized there was way more material here than we could reasonably talk about in one episode. So we're going to be covering part 1 of the Poppy War today, and in 2 weeks we're going to do part 2, followed by part 3 2 weeks after that.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about The Poppy War by RF Kuang. Nate, I see in the show notes that you wanted me to explain exactly why I decided on this book in particular.
Well, I actually put a question mark there because I figured you probably just looked at a list and said, let's go with that one. But if you have an actual reason, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I did actually have a couple of reasons. I picked this book mainly because all the descriptions I'd read of it reminded me of Avatar or another graphic novel I read called The Nameless City. There's been a couple of things coming out recently that are just more based on Asian, specifically Chinese mythologies. And I thought this might be an interesting book to read. It was the first book from the author. So, yeah, that's sort of all factored into why we chose The Poppy War. You want to talk a little bit about the author's background? I'll chime in as necessary.
So she is depressingly young. She finished this book last year. She's a Chinese-American immigrant, came to this country when she was 4 years old. Again, 22, and this was her first book. And if you recall, Ben, our first book, I think I was 25, and that was Eden.
Yeah, I especially loved reading the Wikipedia. It was either the Wikipedia or one of the interviews where she says, yeah, so I wrote the book in 3 months, and then I got an agent, and then I got published. I was like, what am I doing wrong, man?
Yeah.
Probably not writing good books.
Available on Amazon, by the way.
Oh, this is much better than our book. Read her book.
Anyway, she's currently pursuing a Master of Philosophy in Modern Chinese Studies at Cambridge University. I do have her beat there. I do have a master's degree already, so that's how I choose to redefine success.
How nice for you.
How nice for me, specifically.
Yeah. Not
for you. There was a sequel that was released this year, in August, actually, and there's a third one planned, and I guess knowing her, it will be out next year.
I don't know, though. I mean, well, I guess she did come out with the sequel pretty quickly. It seems like for some authors, they have the story ruminating in their head for a while, and their first trilogy or first series comes out really quick, and then the next one, it slows down a little bit because she might have been developing this as like headcanon for I don't know how many years, maybe since she got interested in Chinese philosophy, because the book is very heavily inspired by all sorts of Eastern philosophy and the history of China as well.
I did see somewhere that she started writing this when she was 19. But I guess you said she wrote it in 3 months, which is crazy if true.
I can't remember. I'd have to check my notes. It was one of the interviews she gave. Maybe it was with... I'll have to come back to that.
All right. So do you want to go into the book now? I'll let you tackle that, just like last time.
Lovely. Okay. So, as with any good fantasy novel, we should probably talk a little bit about the setting and the world. This takes place in a fantasy version of 15th century China, with some exceptions. There is an empire for the main feudal government, and it seems to be set just after a warring states period where several different warlords each controlled a province, and they've been united through conquest under one banner into the country of Nikara, which is a loose analog for feudal China. Several other countries exist in the world. Hesperia seems to be an analog for Europe.
White people?
Yes. I think it's definitely an analog for at least Western Europe. I don't, because there was mention of another group of people called Bolognians. I didn't name them.
I completely forgot about Bolognians.
There's mention of the Bolognians, and there's, of course, the Muganese, who are an analog for Japan.
And then there's the hinterlands, which are to the north of them. Is that Russia or is that Mongolia?
I took it to be Mongolia.
That's what I thought as well.
Yeah, but I guess it could be, indigenous populations of Siberia as well. But they mention pretty specifically that they look more or less like other Nikarans. And there's also, of course, the Spearleys from the island nation of Spear, and
which I thought was Korea at first, but I think we kind of thought it was more like Pacific Islanders in general.
Yeah, I got a Polynesian vibe, but I'm not.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a fictional race. I think I made the joke that they're basically the Ishbalans from Full Metal Alchemist. If I can have an anime.
Red eyes, dark skin.
So, opium features pretty heavily in the book. Opium addiction is a big factor, especially in the first part of the book. They talk about the Empire having a total ban on drugs and a war on drugs. And so basically all opium has to be smuggled in, and there's a lot of money in the underground opium market.
In the real world, it was the British. And in this world, it was the stand-ins for the Japanese that brought the opium into fantasy China.
It almost becomes a little problematic that the allegory is so one-to-one in parts of the book, with certain events being copied almost verbatim from history books, that when you then take and make a group of people that is so heavily inspired by an actual group of people just sort of this big bad, like cartoonishly bad.
They are mustache-twirling, cartoonishly evil people.
Like, it's only problematic in the sense that when they want to have a fantasy, they have a fantasy, and when they want to draw inspiration, they draw inspiration from real events. I guess we'll get into this later when we talk about some of the actual events that happen in the book, but a lot of brutal World War II history is explained in pretty gruesome detail at certain parts of this book.
So it's called the Poppy War, but the Poppy War in the book is actually the Sino-Japanese War and World War II from China's perspective. It's actually not the Opium War, which took place much earlier in China's history.
I know we already went over the author's history. She has a master's of philosophy, I think, and she specializes...
No. She is working on a master's. I remember this because it was the one thing I had over.
Oh, you... Okay. Yeah, well, we can't all have your fancy degrees. But no, you could tell that her passion for Chinese history really shines through. The reason I'm mentioning that so much in trying to explain the setting in the world is because while Tolkien and other similar things are inspired by Celtic history and Germanic folklore, this goes so heavily into straight up allegory that it is difficult to distinguish where the fantasy world is and where the historical actual world happens. There's parts of the book that I really think don't work on their own if you don't know what she's referencing. So that's pretty much how I would describe the political setting of the world. It's a mishmash of 15th century Chinese politics and sort of turn of the 20th century World War I, World War II era Chinese politics and Sino-Japanese relations. The book's fantasy element is inspired by Chinese religion, which is complicated and I don't know a lot about it. So I don't know how one-to-one this is with other Chinese works, but there's a lot of mysticism in Chinese philosophy and shamanism that really makes up the spiritual and fantastical core of the book. The magic system almost reminds me a little bit more of an urban fantasy style magic system. I found myself thinking more and more along the lines of another book I'm a fan of called The Bone Season. It's a series of almost young adult novels. It's probably airing just a little bit more on the mature side. And a lot of the elements of urban fantasy really come into play with this, where there's magic exists, but it's sort of in its own secret world. And you have to, there's a weird subculture of people who sort of are the authorities on the magic. And I would not describe this as a high fantasy novel, which
I would not either.
Based on all the marketing, though, and everything, I thought this was going to be a high fantasy novel.
Yeah, and that's a problem that we'll get into as we discuss probably part 3, but it's set up in part 1, and then it kind of goes a completely different direction from what I thought it would be based on the setup and the marketing.
Okay. So the next thing I'll talk about is our main character, Rin, is a early, like, preteen war orphan from the first Poppy War, I believe. Her parents were both murdered in the first Poppy War, and as part of a government placement program, all families with 2 or fewer children had to take in at least one war orphan. Rin was placed with some not-so-nice foster parents, the Fongs, and they have been pretty abusive towards her. I'd say it's pretty much abuse. They mention they're physically abusive and certainly emotionally abusive. The Fongs run a small general store in town. They live in a backwater town called Tikani in the rural Rooster province. And the Fongs, in addition to running their store, also dabble in a little bit of opium smuggling. And the book opens up with Rin in something of a predicament, as the Fongs would like to marry her off to the local customs inspector. This would give them an in with the customs inspector and make their opium smuggling operation a lot more profitable. But Rin, understandably, doesn't want a forced marriage with a much older man she barely knows. So she starts looking for alternatives. One alternative is the Keiju, which is a test given out, I think it's open to anybody who can afford the entry fee.
That's correct.
And it allows you to place into the various educational institutions throughout the empire. Most of them still require that you pay tuition, which would rule Rin out. But if she manages to get accepted to the very most exclusive academy in all of the empire, her admission becomes a royal decree, and her tuition is paid, and no one can stop her from going.
Nobody can see where this is going to go, I'm sure.
Yes. I do want to talk a little bit about the Keiju. Initially, I thought, like, it was a little silly that in this medieval setting, there's, like, basically a medieval SATs. But that actually happened. I did a little bit of research. China actually did have these service exams that you had to pass.
Wow. I didn't know that either.
Yeah, that did actually happen in 15th century China. I don't know if it was for as many different kinds of institutions as there are in this book, but definitely for government positions and clerical positions, they had this kind of placement exam. It was Confucian idea, I think, to put people in based on merit rather than just nepotism. And so that was actually interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Our podcast is educational.
Yeah. Well, it educated me because I was ready to make fun of it. And I think in one of our previous conversations, I did actually make fun of it. And then I looked it up, and yeah, I'm the idiot. Surprisingly, I know. So Rin finds herself a teacher. She manages to make a shady deal with a fairly shady teacher who accepts opium in lieu of payment. Opium that Rin stole from drug smugglers. So that's kind of a cool start to our fantasy novel. Not the usual Bilbo Baggins hijinks I'm used to. And Rin goes through brutally realistic study montage where she uses pain to keep herself awake. She arranges a contraption with a candle that will drip burning hot wax onto her should she dip her head so far. And she manages to stay up all night, every night for like 2 years, destroying her health, and studies for the Keiju.
Destroying her health is actually a theme with Rin as we go through the story.
Yeah, maybe that's an interesting thing to talk about. So you have a medical background, and this is something I'm sort of into, is like getting enough sleep, getting the proper amount of exercise. How realistic is Rin's studying? Would she have been able, like they mentioned just Rin's constant sleep deprivation seems a little unattainable to me, but maybe I'm wrong.
It is entirely unattainable. Like, there's a disease, it's really rare, but I believe it's called fatal insomnia. It's where you can't sleep and you just die after a while. I also, you need sleep to be able to have, like, greater focus. I wouldn't go into a test that could determine my fate on no sleep for 2 years.
Yeah, and I think obviously it was, I don't think you were meant to think that she never she never slept for 2 years, but
it came off that way.
Yeah, you mentioned though that like self-harm is a constant, like, and it's not really supposed to be self-harm, I guess, but this idea of physically sacrificing for her education, for her career, is something that Rin goes through time and time again, and I was just like, ugh, I don't know if I'd be glorifying this, but I guess they're not really glorifying it. It's just she was between just the ultimate rock and a hard place of forced marriage or grueling training, and she chose grueling training, and it does emphasize just how bad her circumstances were. So Rin does take the test, and she passes. She gets into the very, very best school, and there's a little bit of a comedy scene where people think she cheated, but there's all pretty aggressive and invasive anti-cheating protocols, so she skates with that.
They send you into the test wearing a bag.
I don't remember exactly what the garment is, but they do make you strip and physically inspect you, and then give you something to wear to take the test in that you can't hide anything in. But yeah, Rin being a girl with no real formal backing, coming from this rural area, the local leaders are very annoyed that she made it ahead of their own children, and that treatment doesn't change. Basically,
yeah, they write her as the ultimate underdog. She is a woman. She has dark skin. She is from a poor town in the poorest province, and she's a war orphan. They just stack everything against her.
I was wondering, did you get a little bit of like a Harry Potter vibe? I just thought like the treatment of the terrible, not step-parents in this case, I guess. It really mimicked Harry Potter, and especially just this idea of there being a fancy academy that's going to fix all your problems. Like, at first I got a very, like, this is a very cynical version of the Harry Potter story. You're a shaman, Rin. Everything sucks.
They really needed some more opium smuggling in Harry Potter.
Yeah, that would have made Harry a lot more street, I'll tell you that. So Rin gets to the academy, which is the Sign-Guard Academy. I think that's just what it's called, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Sign-Guard being the capital of Nikara. She goes to Sign-Guard. She enrolls in the academy. She immediately meets her nemesis, her Draco Malfoy, if you will. Her nemesis, of course, insults her teacher, and she straight up punches him in the face. Came out of nowhere a little bit. It was.
Are you struggling to remember his name?
No, I know his name.
Okay.
Nezha.
Right.
Nezha, right?
Yes. You hadn't mentioned it, so I was a little worried.
Her nemesis's name is Nezha. He is the noblest of nobles, basically a prince, I think. He's the son of the most important province's general.
Yes, that's right. The warlord, the dragon warlord. So he's the exact opposite of Rin, essentially.
Yes, he comes from a place of extreme privilege, but he's not the exact opposite of Rin in that he doesn't have any natural talent or work ethic. I think they're both pretty similar in that. She's obviously worked harder. He does establish himself. The one thing I wanted to ask you just about her meeting with Nezha. Did it? I'm skipping over a little bit just because it's a very long book, but the book goes to great lengths to establish itself with a sort of gritty realism. Opium is a thing. Drug abuse is a thing. They do not paint it with any kind of candy-coated coloring. It is all brutal and real. She encounters very real poverty on the way to the academy. The consequences for her actions are set up to be incredibly realistic. It struck me as a little bit out of place for Rin to just punch this noble, even as insulting as he was being.
Yeah, and actually, she later on kicks him right in the nuts in front of everyone. And it takes a while for things to actually come back around to her and for her to experience actual consequences.
I mean, she makes an enemy, a pretty bitter enemy. There are consequences. It's just interesting. She punches him, and it's kind of played off for laughs. Like, students aren't supposed to fight. And an upperclassman sort of breaks up the fight, and everything's more or less cool. I guess it is a little bit of a mixed bag, so I don't want to be too critical. But the culture at Signgard is such that it is trying to be a merit-based system. They want the best of the best, and there seem to be people at this academy who genuinely want the best of the best, regardless of where they came from, and others who want to preserve the aristocracy. And so I guess this is a good scene for that. There are, I'd say the faculty is probably about split down the middle on that.
That sounds pretty accurate.
So, yeah, moving on a little bit, she finds out that just being accepted to the school does not guarantee 4 to 5 years of study.
Correct.
In order to survive your first year, you must be invited to pledge a specific track. Though the available tracks are medicine, martial arts, tactics,
history,
thank you, and lore. Am I missing one?
I think we discussed
linguistics
this last time. What's that?
Linguistics.
Was that really one?
I believe so, yes.
Because last time I thought we were missing one, and we decided that we were not missing one.
I think it's tactics, history, linguistics, medicine, martial arts, and lore.
Huh.
For a total of 6.
Well, if we're wrong, people will let us know, I'm sure.
Yep, but regardless, apprentices of the various tracks wear a specific colored armband. And as Rin looks around, she notices nobody's wearing the lore armband. And when the professors of each track introduce themselves, wouldn't you know it, that the lore guy is wacky and disrespectful, and he doesn't seem to be taking it very seriously, and nobody really seems to like him.
I wonder which track Rin is going to end up pledging by the end of it.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss?
I am an uncultured swine, so I am not familiar with that.
It's okay. I'm going to take a bold stance and say I don't really like it that much. That will get us some comments. But in Name of the Wind, there is a similar academic institution, and it has similar sort of specialties. And one of them, I forget exactly what it's called. I think it's just called naming. And that is what this reminded me of. Like, this whole academy, the main character of Name of the Wind, his family is also killed. He is an orphan. He's a little bit more of a golden boy than Rin. Like, he's just naturally good at everything. Rin, at least, works very hard for everything she has. But yeah, there's this same sort of like crazy professor who nobody really knows what he does. He does this kind of like old thing that people used to believe in, but we're starting to move towards science, and people are starting to think like maybe that was all just bullshit. And that's the exact vibe I got as soon as the lore professor was introduced. I'd be very interested to know if RF Kuang has ever read Name of the Wind. Rin does manage to make one friend who is a noble, by the name of Chen Kite, Chen being the family name. And he is super rich and has a photographic memory. So he barely has to study, remembers everything he reads. The academy is mostly made up of nobles. I think Rin is one of, if not the only commoner.
That's correct.
And Nezha being basically a prince. Other nobles are rushing to curry favor with him. Rin's constant clashes with him. She doesn't really have a chance of being any kind of popular if she continues to clash with him, which she does. And so when she gets into this fight with him, she embarrasses him yet again. He undermines her at every turn. And the only friend she has left is Kite, who basically they bond over being rejected by Nezha. Nezha has also decided that Kite is not the coolest kid in the room anymore, so I don't know if
they knew each other before they came to the academy. They
Yeah.
grew up together, and Nezha never really cared about Kite at all.
Yeah. They don't really give a reason for why Kite and Nezha had their falling out. Like, they seem to be childhood friends. I think it started out, I could be wrong, but I think he mentions very briefly they were friends when they were extremely small. And then as they grew up, it's sort of like the kid you're friends with just because you're neighbors.
Yes. Yeah,
then-
that's the vibe I got.
Yeah, and then as you get into school, you realize like, oh, I don't really have anything in common with you.
So moving on from that, although you're supposed to pledge a track, you only get to do that by doing a final exam, and you're only going to be accepted into a track by at least showing some competence in everything. So they have to go to all of their classes. The lore class takes place in a garden of drugs in what is a strict zero tolerance campus.
My high school had a greenhouse, and it became much like this garden.
People are growing weed out there.
We had several tomato plants that never produced a tomato. I relate to this experience. I, too, had a class in a garden with a teacher that didn't pay that much attention.
Yeah, the lore teacher never shows up to class, and all the other students, except for Rin, just stop showing up.
I think maybe she and Kite keep going, and they just sort of hang out and study there. They almost treat it like a free period.
That's probably accurate. I know that she went there all the time later in the book. In her history class, I think the only thing of real interest there is the question, how did Nikara win the first Poppy War? And the answer is they didn't. The Muganese destroyed Spear, which was a client state to Nikara at the time. They utterly annihilated the island. They came over in the dead of night, killed all the inhabitants, razed the buildings to the ground, destroyed their temple, and because of that atrocity, the Hesperians, who, if you recall, are at least Western Europeans, they got involved in this international incident, and they put a stop to the war, and Nikara happened to just benefit from the fact that Hesperia won the war for them.
Let me back up and add one more thing to that. What was Spear, and why was it a target? I think the way the Spearleys were described is they were sort of the shock troops of the Nikara army. They were probably physically larger, I think, and they were a very militaristic society. Every Spearley was sort of trained from birth in a Spartan-style living situation to be a soldier. They worshipped a violent god called the Phoenix, and the Phoenix supposedly gave them powers in battle. There's a bit of magical lore associated with that. Magic is not something that is widely believed in. The main way religion is approached in the land of Nikara, the Nikarans have historical, cultural spirits and deities that they still sort of pay homage to, but nobody really believes that they physically exist. So that the Spearleys had this god that they worshipped so intensely, and that it supposedly gave them mystical powers. People who actually believe that are considered to be superstitious. And the other interesting thing is it mentions the religions of both Hesperia and Mugen as well. The Muganese worship their emperor as a living deity, and the Hesperians worship a one god, a monotheistic religion that seems to be Christianity. And I just wanted to call that out because up until this point in the book, it's been mostly tactical political maneuvering. There hasn't been a lot of magic.
Yeah, I think they explore that more once she, spoiler alert, pledges lore, and that's under her master. Where are we? We were talking about history class and her classes. But we'll just go on to our next class, the tactics course. So in the tactics course, they give you scenarios and then they ask questions on how you would basically solve it. And Rin shows a win at all cost mentality. I believe you called it shoot the hostage.
Rin doesn't show a lot of compassion. I'll put it that way. She's not evil. She just, if she can't rescue the hostage, she's not going to lose sleep over it.
Her plan is to blow a dam in order to rout the enemy forces, not realizing that doing so would mean disaster for years, if not decades, to come after the war is over.
I had a different take on that.
Okay.
The gist of the scenario is that the enemy has captured a civilian village, and attempting to assault the enemy would result in heavy losses. A second option is to blow the dam. That would kill the enemy and the civilians and allow the army to get on its way. She suggests blowing the dam, wiping out the enemy and the civilians, because realistically she has no chance of saving the civilians. She can't assault the village, and she's just stuck right now. So to get moving, she's going to flood it, and she does understand that it would cripple the economy of the region for decades to come. She understands it would ruin the farmland, it would take decades to rebuild the dam itself, but she's thinking, well, what's the difference to me if I don't have a country anymore? Like, why do I care about economics if I'm dead? Her tactics professor points out that she's not thinking about the long-term victory. That if she did win, she would have to come back and rule these people who now have heard about how she just sacrificed a village, crippled it economically, and just moved on. And so that's Rin's sort of first introduction to leadership. At this point, Rin has not really done much more in her life than survive at any cost. She sacrifices her own health, she sacrifices her possessions and comfort and just everything she has to survive. And this is the first taste she really gets of, that is a good way to survive, but perhaps not the best way to thrive. That was my take.
That's reasonable. The next class that Rin has is the martial arts class. It's about instructing you on basic forms and redirecting energy. Is that accurate? Is that how you would describe it?
I'm a big fan of martial arts. So I will say the martial arts class is a combination of traditional martial arts like kung fu concepts, but without a lot of the philosophy and religious overtones stripped out. She's learning martial arts that are intended to be used solely in military combat. They have a concept of ki, but yeah, it's like you said, it's more about the sort of jujitsu concept of like redirecting force and maximizing force dispersal. It's not Dragon Ball Z ki energy blast type stuff. Jun is the martial arts teacher. Jun is one of the teachers who is very much in favor of the aristocracy. He doesn't think Rin has a place there. He doesn't like her. Rin has never fought with weapons before. That's the sort of training only nobles get. He has the students pair up to do staff drills. And I really think all they're supposed to do is like attack and block. And before the drill even begins, Nezha starts beating her down with the staff to the point where Rin is afraid for her life. Rin then retaliates by just abandoning the staff and tackling Nezha. And it devolves to the point where Jun has to come over and break it up. Jun breaks it up. He gives Nezha a suspension. But Rin, this is the excuse he's been waiting for. He tells her he will not be instructing her. He doesn't have the power to kick her out of the school, but he can kick her out of his gym. She's not allowed to train in the gym, and he bans anyone else from practicing with her. That is going to cripple Rin's chances of pledging any track. And the reason that's going to cripple Rin's chances of pledging any track is because she needs to demonstrate competency in all the core areas of the curriculum. The martial arts area of the curriculum will be tested at the end of the year in a tournament. And if Rin performs horribly in that tournament, she's not going to be competent enough in martial arts for any professor, no matter how much they may like her or want her to pledge their track. She's not going to be considered competent to be a soldier. And so they'll have to let her go. So this is basically when Rin has kind of lost it all. This is one of her lowest moments.
Didn't use "get the fuck out of my gym," so I'm really upset. After she gets thrown out, Rin decides she's gonna teach herself martial arts from a book. And so she steals some books that are meant for second level or above, and she goes to the drug garden, and she attempts to train herself in the martial arts.
As somebody who did a bit of martial arts, we had a manual, particularly for the advanced forms, like beyond, say, second Dan black belt. You'd be trained, so somebody would show you how to do the forms, but it was, as you get higher up, it's harder to find people who know the forms, and you might only get a chance to work with them once a month, and you might have to travel to do it. So they have a book with the form in it in case you forget the movements or something like that. I was going to be very angry if Rin successfully taught herself martial arts from a book. That's all I was going to say, 'cause I know I couldn't.
As you just said, she does not successfully teach herself with a book. Zhang, the drug-addicted absentee lore master, comes by to his drug garden, and he finds Rin attempting to teach herself with a book and finds the idea ludicrous, and she just happens to get this wise old man to teach her the form.
Of course, Zhang is a martial arts master. Of course, this dopey, drugged up dude who nobody respects, of course he's a fighting badass.
Did you see that coming?
Yes.
Yeah, so did
yes,
I.
I did. Yeah, he teaches her the old ways.
Yeah, he teaches her the non-UFC version of the form.
Well, I mentioned before that they are teaching a traditional kung fu, and I think they do mention this in the book, is meant to be a form of almost worship through physical motion. And so a lot of the movements are purposely exaggerated and inefficient. And so the military, much like actually did happen in militaries around the world, like Taekwondo is a militarized form of Korean martial art. They take out the more inefficient movements, the more ridiculous, fanciful kicks, and make it like that UFC kind of style of combat where it's the most bang for your buck every time. So
more martial, less art.
Yeah. So what Zhang is teaching her is sort of the root of all that martial art. He's teaching her the more spiritual movements.
They train for months, and that kind of goes by pretty quick as they approach the finals.
Yeah, she punches some meat, runs up some stairs.
That would have been great.
She carries a pig.
That's true. She goes to the city picks up a pig and carries it up a mountain as part of her training, and she has to still study for her other classes on top of this, so she has to get up really early, or I guess just not go to sleep, in order to do this training.
It'll
And
work. I
then-
mean, hey, like, what was it? I'm referencing a bunch of anime right now, and I know I sound like a nerd, but like, what was One Punch Man? You know, 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, 5-kilometer run, 10-kilometer run, or carry a pig up a mountain.
Rocky IV.
Rocky
He was
IV,
out in the-
Pig Mountain.
Out in the Siberian wilderness, and he was chopping wood, and didn't he walk up a mountain with weights on him or something? Like
Yeah, I mean,
buckets of water or whatever.
yeah, which is what you do, you know, if you're not man enough to carry a pig.
Calling out Sly Stallone, huh?
Hey, I'm just saying,
Get on Ren's level.
yeah, my girl Ren's learning some Super Saiyan stuff here.
So we approach the finals. Zhang wants her to pledge lore, and she would rather go into tactics. She says she wanted to be a good soldier. I always felt like it was more she wanted a cushy job and to be made for life. I didn't ever get a strong sense of patriotism, but that line seems to imply one, and I know you asked about this last time. So, any more thoughts on that?
I've picked on a couple of things about the book. One of the things I absolutely love about the book is Zhang. I love old school martial arts. I'm not a big fan of like the UFC stuff. I love that tradition and philosophy and everything Zhang seems to be about. And I think I do think you're right. I think that Rin probably just wants the cushy job, but I just have such a hard time with her decision because I want to pledge lore. like I want to find out what this dude knows. I want to know where he got all this.
I, on the other hand, would have gone with tactics because I like the abstract. It's a lot like case study. You're given a situation, you have to figure out what's going on with the person. It's the same thing, except now it's, war.
Tactics would be a close second, but for Rin to be super patriotic, she's not super patriotic, but for her to go like put her life on the line for this country that's really only taken from her, I don't know. Especially because it just seems like for another problem for Rin is just going to be the continued prejudice. Like if she becomes a master tactician, she's just constantly going to be dealing with this aristocratic bullshit.
Well, in her defense, what was his name? The great Korean general who got demoted a million times, but he defended Korea from Japan in like the 14 or 1500s. Admiral Yi.
Okay.
Yeah, he was constantly demoted and screwed over, and in the end, history had his back, I assume.
Okay.
At least in half of Korea.
But did, like, he get a mansion?
He got an honorable death at sea, actually.
Yeah. Woo. Are you there?
All right.
Okay.
I'm like, fuck, what do we do next? I guess so she says she wants to go into tactics, and Zhang is disappointed in this and basically avoids her from here on out.
Yeah, he acts like a child.
Yes. And that leads into the finals. The finals are set up where you are quizzed directly by the teacher in an oral exam. You miss one question and you're done. And if you get it right, you keep getting asked more and more questions. So the more you know and the better you're able to answer your questions, the more questions you get asked and the more you are going to be able to show off what you know. Zhang has not been asking anyone any lore questions, and when Rin's turn comes up, Zhang decides that he's going to ask them a question.
Who is imprisoned in the Chulu Korik?
Rin thinks about it for a moment. She's never been told what this thing is. She has no idea what it is. She's never heard of it. And her answer was...
unnatural criminals who committed unnatural crimes.
And Zhang doesn't really give any indication on how right or wrong that is. He just says he has no further question.
I think Jun laughs at her.
Jun's an asshole.
Yeah, he's not a likable man.
So I will let you start talking about the tournament.
So as we said before, the martial arts portion of the final exams is a tournament. And this will actually be Rin's first time fighting anyone but Zhang with her old-fashioned martial arts. One thing I wanted to ask, actually, before we get started. Knowing that there is a supernatural aspect to these books, knowing that the sort of philosophy that Zhang's into is based in truth, do you think Rin's more traditional martial arts have some kind of spiritual advantage?
You know, I'm not sure. I think you would actually be a better person to ask or hear their opinion on it. I do not know anything about martial arts. My plan for getting into a fight involves running away while peeing myself. So,
well,
what do you think? Do you think that gave her an advantage to channel the Phoenix? Spoilers.
Well, the interesting thing I was going to say, before she does any kind of magic, she does quite well in the tournament. Obviously, the tournament is built up to be a showdown between Rin and Nezha. Nezha and Rin each fight various bouts before working their way up to each other, and they both dominate their respective brackets. Rin finds out very quickly that the martial arts that Zhang was teaching her are valid, and she has a slight advantage because she's the only person coming into the ring with a different style. So far, everybody else has been doing the exact same sort of thing. It's interesting to me a little bit that we know that the spiritual side is valid and there is a lot of truth there. And so these more traditional martial arts that were designed to be meditative tools should be effective against, like, say, a UFC style of combat. Because realistically, like, there is a reason that military martial arts, like military hand-to-hand combat training, doesn't teach you how to throw jump spinning crescent kicks. The athleticism required to do a jump spinning crescent kick is valuable, but that is not the sort of kick you would want to deploy in a life and death situation. Unless it's like a finish him moment. Like, if that dude's pretty much unconscious, you might land that kick. But yeah, it was interesting to me. Now, Rin does fight very efficiently. She's not doing a lot of fancy flowy stuff. But there must be a reason Zhang favors those old styles. And it probably is for the meditative state of mind. Because I think he wants her to pledge lore, and he wants to continue her training because she's showing a potential. And I think he must have sensed that while she was practicing, I think that her, for lack of a better word, spiritual power was growing. Just a theory. So anyway, they do dominate their respective brackets. The final fight between Rin and Nezha comes. And they wind up being surprisingly evenly matched. This is where I think Nezha really shows that he's not just a spoiled brat. He actually does have some talent. And he is using his training and his superior size to his advantage. He's really pressing Rin into a corner. They go back and forth, but really Nezha is starting to get the upper hand. And when he's in full control of the fight, he just open hand slaps Rin across the face. And that is a level of disrespect and humiliation that Rin cannot abide, and something snaps within her, and she feels as if she is on fire. Her vision sort of goes red, and she charges Neja. Neja punches her in the face, shrugs it off. Punches her again in the face, she shrugs it off again. And she's taking damage. I mean, she's coming at him like a madman now. He actually, I think, says, like, why won't you quit? And she just starts laying into him then and beats him to the point where the ref intervenes and says, like, okay, fight's over. And she keeps beating him, and she's grabs him by the hair, smacks his head off the ground. Like, she's going to kill him. All the teachers finally jump in and do pull her off. She shrugs even them off and storms out of the ring and storms directly to Zhang, who immediately recognizes that something has changed. And he says to her, "You're burning." And she begs him for his help. He does some sort of ritual and places a hand on her, and it cools her down. And she feels the fire start to recede and go away. And this is when she makes her decision to pledge lore. So the one thing I want to go back and talk about, we didn't mention Alton at all. I think we do need to foreshadow him a bit. During Rin's time at the academy, she is introduced by another student to these after-hours fights that take place. Various upperclassmen get together in the evenings and have, I think, really tournament-style matches, and they place bets, and various people challenge other various people to combat. And I think the fights are refereed. It's a little unclear exactly how it's set up. Rin kind of comes in the middle of it. But there's one particular student who all the teachers reference as, like, the perfect example of a student. And his name is not Alton Brown, which is what I almost... That's the Cooking Network guy.
Trenzin.
Alton Trengson. Alton is the last survivor of the Spearley Massacre. He is a straight-A student, expert in every subject, and he is also, like, the fightingest badass that has ever lived. He is taking on all comers. Everybody in the martial arts track's dream is to beat Alton. When Rin watches Alton fight, she's just totally mesmerized by him. He changes his approach based on each new opponent. He seems to be a master of many different styles and ways of fighting. And through conversations with other students, she learns that Alton's dream pledge was lore. And there is a rumor that at the last minute, Zhang refused to teach Alton, and Alton was forced to pledge tactics instead. And so, in the background, Rin's always fascinated by Alton, particularly the way he fights. So once Rin's made up her mind to pledge lore, the book does a bit of a time skip. We have kind of a montage of Rin's lore training under Zhang. He has her do a variety of strange Karate Kid style tasks where the meaning of what she's doing isn't really apparent to her while she's doing it. Whenever she asks him a question, he answers with another question or prompts her to give him research papers compiling various, like, disparate sets of data. He has her compare and contrast all of the world's religions. And gradually Rin realizes that he's teaching her lore. Lore is kind of the lost religion of Nikara. The Nikarans used to have shamanistic practices. And the more Rin studies under Zhang, the more Rin realizes that these shamanistic practices are not just spiritual superstition. They have tangible results. Zhang is able to demonstrate this to Rin by controlling the wind and various other tricks. And the drugs he cultivates in his garden facilitate the shamanistic practice. Disturbingly, Rin shows a tendency towards wanting to use shamanism for war. She wonders why the military has not weaponized these practices. Why isn't every student taught shamanism alongside martial arts? Zhang explains to her that, shamanism is a relationship one has to cultivate with the natural world. It's not something you can just put on a factory floor and reproduce infinitely in a military style curriculum. This is actually another point where I want to ask you again. Now that we've read a little further into the book, does it make sense that Rin's first instinct is to use shamanism for war?
I didn't think it was to use it for war. I got the sense that she grew up powerless, and so she wants to get the power of the gods so that she'll never be in a position of powerlessness again. I could be reading too much into that.
No, I think that's actually a really valid take. Eventually, Zhang allows Rin to go on a trip. I don't know how else to put it.
Accurate.
He sends her to a cave to meditate with the assistance of a drug. Rin takes the drug and begins to meditate. She has a very profound spiritual experience. It's described that she feels a sense of oneness with the universe. She can feel the life of the forest and the world. She can feel ants climbing on tree roots, water moving through the underground lakes. And eventually she is transported to a place called the Pantheon. And when she reaches the Pantheon, she sees a variety of pedestals and plinths, each depicting various gods. Is it described as there being just almost infinite gods?
I thought that there were 64.
Okay,
I thought there was a solid number.
I think you're right, because they do get into more of the zodiac type stuff later. So she sees all the plinths and monuments to the various gods, and one of them catches her eye, the Phoenix, the god of the Spearleys. There is a woman warning her to stay away from the Phoenix. She's pretty insistent, pretty frantic that Rin not work with the Phoenix. She warns Rin that the Phoenix only takes, it gives nothing, and it will burn her. When Rin comes back from the trip, Zhang is there to welcome her back to the waking world, and he asks her what she sees, and she tells him about this profound experience. But I think she purposely omits the experience with the ghost.
Correct.
She's still avoiding telling Zhang what she's thinking, which is basically that she wants to use the gods as weapons against her enemies.
Yeah, at this point, Zhang basically tells her, well, great, you're cured. Now, next time you are filled with heat like that, you'll know how to calm yourself down, and great, mission accomplished. That was what we were doing, right?
And that is not what Rin wants. And that bothered the hell out of me. It bothered me so much. So I know I'm more into philosophy and meditation and stuff like that than you are, but do you think it's odd? Can you imagine having an experience where the barriers between all living beings dissolve and you realize that you're just part of one great whole, and then being and I need a big gun to kill them all?
No, actually. And initially, I did not think anything about that. And as you brought it up more and more, I'm like, yeah, that is really stupid. How did she achieve oneness and come away thinking, but we're more one than everyone else is?
Yeah, but Nikara is the best. And it frustrated me a bit because I enjoyed that part of the book so much. I enjoy Zhang's character so much. I really like the philosophy and the religion and everything he was trying to teach her. And I think it's frustrating to me that she can get so far down that path and then just make an immediate U-turn back to violence.
I could understand it later in the book.
Yes, I could.
But
yeah.
But yes, you're right. it does seem very strange.
I almost wish this sequence could be rewritten slightly. Everything would be fixed for me if she makes it to the Pantheon before experiencing all these profound spiritual things. The Pantheon to me, like, this is going to be a recurring theme for the rest of the book. This is the magic system. Shamanism is the magic of this world, and the gods are sort of the medium through which the magic travels. I feel like Zhang understands this, which means the author understands this, that the gods are almost like a distraction on the path to enlightenment, particularly the Phoenix. And I just kind of wish that it would make so much more sense to me if it was possible to get to the Pantheon without having a profound spiritual experience, because I feel like it undermines the profound spiritual experience to then immediately think, how can I make this mine? I'll digress. She at least knows enough to not tell Zhang what she's thinking about doing. And if you're going to tell this kind of Anakin Skywalker story, this is a better way to tell it than what George Lucas did. Oh, spoilers.
This is the end of part 1.
Yeah, that really is. That is the last sentence, that she is lying to Zhang. I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
Only referencing part 1, how do you think this book compares to other recent fantasy series? And I'm going to say recent fantasy series being like Harry Potter, Name of the Wind. I don't want to go back to like Tolkien.
Yeah, if it helps, I've read the first 3 Harry Potters. And I've never read Name of the Wind. I would say, it definitely ranks among them. I mean, it's very, I guess, is formulaic the word I'm looking for? Or tropey? It's definitely a hero's journey. It's a magical school. It's learn the old ways.
Do you think it does enough to differentiate itself from the formula?
Just in this part, I would say no. If you just look at part 1, I would say this could be, with the exception of maybe the opium at the very beginning, okay, and the drug use. If you took that out, this could be almost any young adult coming of age story.
I don't know if I agree. I think, yes, it's definitely influenced by the things that came before it. It's got a little Harry Potter. It's got a lot of Name of the Wind. I'd be surprised if she hasn't read it. But I do think Rin's character specifically, she's not Harry Potter, for sure. She does not have that heart of gold. And you do see a little bit of darkness in her that you don't see in the other characters in the same way. I think that's where I'd say it does.
You see darkness in her character that we just went and debated doesn't really make sense by the end.
Well, it doesn't make sense in the context of the experiences that she had. It does bother me. That is a criticism I have. I almost want to say that's an editing issue, though. Like, if you just change a couple of sentences there, I think it works. So I don't want to focus too hard on that. But I do think Rin is more of a character than most young adult fiction. Harry Potter excluded. Harry Potter is a good character, but a lot of the young adult stuff that's come out recently, like the Hunger Games and Twilight and all that, like, Rin is not your average young girl protagonist. She's off the bat.
Fair enough.
She's not interested in romance. I mean, at all.
Yes, she destroys her reproductive organ so that she can study more without being dragged down by them.
That is a bit extreme. But I was going to say
No, you've convinced me. You've convinced me. Because I was thinking, I did read the first Hunger Games, and I couldn't tell you much about Katniss.
A common trope of young adult fiction is that the main character doesn't have a lot of strong personality traits, because the appeal of a lot of those books is kind of the reader self-insert. I think that's at least the appeal of something like Twilight. Like, Bella doesn't have a strong personality. It works. Like, a lot of people,
oh, I'm sure it is,
do enjoy reading that book to insert themselves into Bella's character. I think, based on part 1, what we've just covered, I finished part 1 pretty interested in where this was going to go.
I agree.
Yeah, I was not expecting Rin to become kind of an anti-hero.
All right, everyone. That is our show. We got our final thoughts in. We will be covering part 2 of the Poppy War in 2 weeks. So you still have time to read this book and prepare for that if you want to follow along with us. It might be a book you want to skip if you can't handle graphic depictions of traumatic events. It gets more graphic going forward. We're going to be doing part 3 2 weeks after part 2, and I'm going to go ahead and plug our next book as well.
Yeah, you go ahead and do that. This is a book Nate picked.
So
he doesn't want to read the second Poppy War book, but he does want to read. Take it away, Nate.
So after all that misery and destruction, why don't we all together collectively sit back and relax and read Make Love the Bruce Campbell Way, which is what we're going to be reviewing next.
I'm sorry, Nate, you forgot to mention who's the author of Make Love the Bruce Campbell Way?
The author of Make Love the Bruce Campbell Way is in fact Bruce Campbell.
Goodbye, everybody. You suck.
Fuck you.